Hello, everyone, and thank you for the introduction, Dr. Brian Gerard. My name's Dr. Naomi Rusk, and I'm speaking to you from Boulder, Colorado. I'm delighted to be speaking to you about mental health and the brain, stress resilience, and nervous system health in youth and young adults. And this feels like a topic of critical importance today, given the current war that's going on and the pandemic that we're still all living through. Children have been very hard hit. And in terms of mental health and mental wellness, I just want you to know I'm speaking to you about nervous system health and brain health, certainly as a psychologist, neuropsychologist, trained in neuroscience. I'm also speaking to you, though, as a brain health coach, as a resilience trainer. I think my most important role in giving this talk to you is that I am actually a mother, and I care very much about, I speak to you from that perspective, and I care very much about the current generation of young adults and them being mentally well and brain healthy moving forward in their lives. But indeed, we are really in a crisis right now, and we were before the war and the pandemic in terms of young adults, teens, mental health, and psychiatric wellness. And my first slide is a quote by Dr. Desmond Tutu. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they are falling in. How can we create a model where prevention is a priority? The global burden of mental health is huge. Mental illness is a leading cause of disability and poor life outcomes for young adults today. The majority of the world's population do not live in countries where mental health is supported by local or federal funding, nor is it backed by the necessary workforce. According to UNICEF, and this is really a tragedy, 1 in 7 adolescents is diagnosed with a mental health disorder. And as of 2020, younger people continue to be more affected by major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders than older age groups. We really need to pay attention. The impact of poor mental health is also huge in terms of the global economy. Of all of the non-communicable diseases, youth mental health problems present the most serious burden to our global economy. 35%. More than cardiovascular disease. And that's why I'm highlighting this. And that's why my focus is really on talking to you guys about prevention, because you're in a role. I'm empowering you to be in that role where you are making a difference. And mental health issues cause the disruption of normal neural development. The onset of mental illness during adolescence and young adulthood disrupts normal development of the brain as well, and the nervous system. In fact, Bruce Perry, a very significant psychiatrist who's recently actually written a book with Oprah Winfrey, says that young babies' nervous systems are formed and informed by the time they're 22 months of age. So imprints and impact upon nervous systems is occurring at very, very young ages. The interruption of these vital processes results in a variety of consequences affecting young people's ability to create their own identity, to complete their education, to find a job, to develop friendships and intimate partnerships, and to begin healthy brain habits and emotional health habits. So what I'm suggesting is that mental wellness benefits social relationships. It benefits physical health and cognitive health. But early prevention is crucial. We need to raise awareness of mental health issues, reduce stigma associated with seeking help, and help young adults form healthy, stress-resilient habits. Stress-resilient habits help them to not get trauma to begin with. But indeed, if young adults and children do have trauma imprints, to help them release those imprints. These are some of the global contributors to declining mental health in adolescents and young adults. Chronic stress and trauma I'm putting right on top because I feel like chronic stress and trauma, there's enough evidence now, it's not just work, that chronic stress and trauma are the root causes for all of the other things that you're going to see in terms of mental illness and psychiatric illness. Root causes for many physical illnesses as well. But depression and anxiety are very impacted by chronic stress and early life trauma. The other things that are global contributors to mental health issues in young people are homelessness, being orphaned, childhood trauma and negative family environment, stress in the family, loss of school, loss of sport, loss of community, and lacking in a daily routine. Kids who lack in a daily routine also really struggle with stress, the impact of stress. Loss of supportive relationships with friends, family members, and mentors. And you can see how COVID played such a big role in many of these items that contribute to declining mental health. Refugee status, food insecurity. The COVID-19 pandemic has been pivotal here. And we're just at the beginning of seeing an unfolding of even more declining mental health and brain health, I'm afraid to say. I want to also mention adverse childhood experiences, because adverse childhood experiences affect neurodevelopment, affect social, emotional, and cognitive health, and they help people not know how to take care of themselves. So early adverse childhood experiences make people not want to take care of themselves, not choose pro-health behaviors. And adverse childhood experiences contribute significantly to chronic diseases like cancer, autoimmune illnesses, social and emotional impairment, and interestingly enough, all kinds of diseases and early death. So this is where we need to begin with really young children to prevent adverse experiences. The COVID-19 pandemic, as I was saying, has had a huge impact, and it's been uneven in terms of global mental health. You'll see in the square, the red square, that youngest people have been hardest hit by major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders, really the cohort that we're speaking to today. Interestingly, females have been more impacted in terms of mental health than males. And in general, the cases of mental health disorders rose very sharply during the pandemic. And you can see these are very critical, these are very credible sources who've cited this very huge study looking at depression and anxiety in over 204 countries. We've got some work to do. It turns out that loneliness is linked with brain changes. The body treats loneliness as a state of threat and responds by activating defensive systems in the body, like the sympathetic nervous system, which in turn prompts the immune system to enhance inflammation. That's one pathway by which social isolation can accelerate the progression of Alzheimer's disease and other inflammation-related chronic diseases. illness are inflammation-related chronic diseases as well. So loneliness has been a very big contributor to this mess of consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And indeed, COVID-19 causes its own inflammation and other systemic changes in people's physiology. But just loneliness itself is changing the brain and the body, and not in a good direction in terms of mental health. You know, we're talking about stress today and threat systems and trauma. And I want to just highlight that stress isn't all bad. And I want to share the upside of stress with you, because most of the talk is about distress, right? Unhealthy stress and prolonged stress. But I want to talk to you about stress, because stress is a very important and adaptive response in the nervous system that helps us cope with everyday life. If we get stuck in a distress response, then it can become prolonged, traumatic, and damaging to the nervous system. But eustress is a kind of stress that is actually motivating, exciting, and it builds performance. It's the kind of stress a young adult might feel if they're getting ready to compete in a soccer game or a football game, or getting ready to compete in any way or try something new that's exciting and motivating. Eustress might actually happen when you're studying for an exam. You study for the exam, you're very stressed, you take the exam, you complete the exam, and you feel a sense of relief. You come down. That's great. It's good if the stress starts and ends in a predictable way. Hormesis is a process of conditioning and adaptation in which low levels of stress stimulate or upregulate cellular and molecular pathways that improve the capacity of cells and organisms to withstand even greater stress. That's great. So hormesis is really a biological term, and it describes a process by which we get stronger and better and more resilient when we experience small amounts of stress that condition and adapt us. So the first two are really positive stressors. What becomes distressing is when there's suffering and there's an emotional toll that can cause hypo or hyper arousal in a nervous system. It can cause us to get very hyper, anxious, irritated, aggressive, or it can cause us to be hypo-aroused in our nervous system. And by that I mean terrified, quiet, withdrawn, and depressed. So fight or flight, transient arousal is good, as I was saying. It's natural. We get afraid by a lion or a tiger. We run, and then we find a safe and wonderful place to be. So this boy can get relief when he runs up the stairs to a lovely treehouse, and the tiger goes about his way, or her way. But some stressors just don't go away, and they persist. So this tiger could just keep on chasing, and this little boy just keeps on running. And some of those stressors that don't go away are COVID-19, war, social injustice, food injustice, gender inequality, disasters, and big threats that persist. Then a nervous system gets primed for trauma and for physiologic dysregulation. And what is trauma? Well, trauma can be personal, relational, cultural, or ancestral. Trauma is a high energy and threatening experience where there's stress, but we get stuck or we feel helpless. And our bodies bear the burden, not just our minds. Trauma is stored in the body, not just in the brain. We develop habituations to trauma, though. Our ways of becoming embodied and how we work in the world become our personality very often. We're either very threatened or very irritated or very depressed or withdrawn or shy, or we take care of other people so much. And our current medical model, though, looks at trauma as a very individualistic situation. And this largely occurs because we tend to see people as one by one. But we need to be thinking really about a wider lens in viewing trauma and understanding that trauma can also be collective and cultural and come from our ancestors as well and get passed down. So I'm introducing you to different levels of trauma. Yes, it can be very personal, it can be relational, it can be cultural, and it can be ancestral. And trauma happens in the face of a prolonged stressor in which we feel helpless. Not all trauma is created equal. We have intergenerational trauma, in utero trauma, perinatal trauma, those adverse childhood experiences I shared with you in one of the earlier slides, neglect, medical trauma, car accidents, abuse in relationships, sexual trauma, and of course there are natural disasters. And wherever you are in the world listening to this, you've had natural disasters and you've had human disasters. And this is the neuroanatomy of that threat response. And we want to be careful not to loop in this threat response, this trauma response. Information loops from the prefrontal cortex, the front portion of the brain, to the amygdala, which is really the alarm system, fire alarm system in the brain, and to other relevant brain regions, including memory centers. And then it circles back to the prefrontal cortex. So really, in all of the treatments that we can do for people that support them to relieve trauma, is we want to be engaging that prefrontal cortex in not just reacting like the amygdala does, but in being able to regulate itself, being able to regulate the body, tell the body and the brain everything's okay, sit with someone who's reassuring to you so that that person can soothe your nervous system and let you know that everything's okay and you don't need to be in that threat response anymore. And of course, we're looking for emotional balance. We're looking to engage the lighthouse, which is that front cortical part of the brain, to calm the amygdala down, which is the image of that tall ship on a very calm sea. And there are many ways to do that, and I'll share some of those at the end of the talk with you. Unfortunately or fortunately, our brains have adapted to be like Velcro for negativity and Teflon for positivity. And a colleague and mentor of mine, that is his quote. And I think that's important because we tend to see the negative. And we do that because we want to stay safe. We want to stay protected. So we capture all of the negative things in our environment to ensure that we will stay okay. This also means that we have to spend more time on positivity, focusing on positivity and really taking it in, breathing in positive experiences and pausing for a bit while we take in those positive experiences so that they can really land and make an imprint in our bodies and our minds. It's important to remember that both threat and safety live in our nervous systems, and we have control very often over what our nervous systems do and where we focus. The sympathetic nervous system is usually associated with arousal, fight or flight. The parasympathetic nervous system is usually associated with rest, digest, Of course, we can go into a sympathetic nervous system response that is aggression and threat. We can also go into a parasympathetic nervous system reaction that is collapse and freeze and not be able to do anything because we're so terrified. But good to know that we can have some flexibility and learn to work with our nervous system, because chronic stress in the body and the brain create persistent inflammation, create changes in the structure and function of our memory system and our emotional systems, as I shared earlier with you. They change our vascular health. And with repeated stress, our blood-brain barrier, that protective layer between our body and our brain, can become leaky. Our blood sugar can raise. And persistent stress or chronic trauma that's unhealed can interfere with sleep. And that's when we consolidate new memory and clear toxins. So going back to threat and safety within our nervous system, we really want to be able to focus on how can we engage safety in our nervous system? How can we focus on that? And we use neuroplasticity to engage, we engage neuroplasticity. We engage that dynamic, alive, natural, endogenous system in our bodies and our brains that allow us to change our nervous system and change our brain, depending upon the environment that we're in and the context that we're in. But it's good to know that we have that agency and that we actually can do a lot of things to improve mental health and brain health by working with our nervous system. Because mental health is a direct contributor to brain health. Again, there's this very strong relationship between mental health disorders in young and middle life and neurologic disorders in later life. And we want to also be doing everything we can to prevent this tsunami of cognitive decline and depression. Pardon me, depression, yes, but dementia as well later in life. And going back to neuroplasticity, it's what we need for our brain health and our mental health. It's our nervous system's ability to change and adapt to both internal and external exposures and experiences. We can develop skills and change our minds and our brains with intention and practice and with effort. Diet plays a big role in mental health. And over the next few slides, I'm going to be sharing with you some things that we can work on. And we can work on with our students, with our patients, with our mentees. And I'll be sharing with you some of the things that we can do to work with other people and with ourselves to create more stress resilience and work with our mental health. Diet plays a much bigger role in mental health than we previously realized. Our gut speaks directly to our brain along something called the gut-brain axis. And the health of our gut directly informs the health of our brain and thus our mental health as well. People like to focus on a Mediterranean diet and a plant-based diet. So that means focusing on whole foods, foods that come directly from the earth and are not processed. We need a lot of nuts and good fats. And the Mediterranean diet has been shown to help depression in 2 recent clinical trials. It's also good to prevent dementia. There are breathing exercises that we can do to reduce stress and increase oxygenation, increase mental clarity. There's diaphragmatic breathing, where we breathe from the diaphragm and the belly rather than from the chest. When we breathe high up, often it can stimulate a sympathetic nervous system response and put us into a state of fear, because rapid breathing like that is something that we engage when we need to fight or flee from a situation. So diaphragmatic breathing can really slow us down. So can box breathing and something called Untitled breathing. And if I ever do a follow-up workshop with you guys, I'm more than happy to speak more about any of these things. We don't have enough time today to go into these things in detail, though. Physical movement of all kinds helps depression, anxiety, stress, and trauma release. We need aerobic movement while our heart is beating really quickly and our blood is flowing and our brain is getting oxygen and more blood flow as well. Resistance training, where we really connect with our muscles and use interoception, which is a real awareness of what's happening inside of our bodies. Cultivating interoception is important with physical movement. There's a wonderful brain yoga training that I know happens in India that I'm looking forward to finding out more about, that a colleague of mine told me about yesterday, actually. There's high intensity interval training where we really get breathless every day. And all of these are important for working with depression, anxiety, and mobilizing trauma. And of course, there are a lot of therapeutic techniques, some of which can happen in a therapist's office, and some of which we can work on ourselves or do with each other. And more, I'm realizing that the general public don't all have access to a therapy office. So we need to learn more about peer support and how to support ourselves and our family members. Reducing stress and releasing trauma from a therapeutic point of view, and I'm speaking as a trauma therapist, surprisingly often requires non-talking type therapies. Therapies where there's more of a feeling of touching into what's happening in someone's body, in their sensory experience, what they're feeling in the moment, how it is person to person in terms of the relationship, if there is a therapist working with someone. We need to extinguish fear, because very often people come with persistent fear and trauma, having a history of carrying fear with them. So we need to learn how to extinguish that and help people do that. It's very important to integrate old, remote, and traumatic memories. So they're not just hanging there in a fragmented way, but they're integrated and they make sense to the mind and to the body. In the therapeutic setting, we use somatic, body-based therapies, and many of the therapies now are very focused on having patients be present in their bodies. There's a lot of success with bilateral eye movements, crossover body movements, like this that I'm doing right now, tapping on alternate shoulders, and yoga is excellent for that. The treatment, names of some of the treatments, just to familiarize yourselves, are EMDR, brain spotting, internal family systems, that's IFS, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, EFT, and integrating someone's narrative into their stress or trauma history. But the necessary ingredient that everyone who's listening to this talk can really, really help with is, first, we need to tune into ourselves, our own stress reactivity, our own feeling in our body right now. I'm doing that right now as I'm speaking to you. I'm checking out how I'm feeling, how calm I am, how excited I am to be talking to you. And I'm tuning into you, even though we're virtual. And so we need to sit with, whether it's virtual or in person, ourselves first before we can regulate our nervous systems with someone else. And then it's important to leave a student or patient or a colleague or a family member with something positive to look forward to engage the reward system. We need to heal, or at least be aware of, intergenerational trauma. And I love this quote by Thich Nhat Hanh, who actually recently died and crossed over to the other side. If you look deeply into the palm of your hand, and I invite you to do that even as we're speaking now, if you look deeply into the palm of your hand, you'll see your parents and all the generations of your ancestors. All of them are alive in this moment, each present in your body. You're the continuation of all of these people. So whoever you're sitting with, and start with yourself, consider what traumas their mother, their father, their grandmother, their grandfather, and their ancestors went through. Drought, famine, war, rape, slavery, grief, hunger. And I know that's a lot. And you know, my concern is this is a short amount of time to give a talk on very big topics. And I hope that you're taking care of yourself. Something, for example, might have come up in your own nervous system as I said those things right now. So take a pause, take a breath, and be in the company of yourself and allow whatever feelings are coming up free now. So here are some healthy habits. Brain health and mental health start with lifestyle and with trauma healing. I want to emphasize the importance of sleep, healthy nutrition, regular exercise, including yoga, relaxation techniques, challenging young brains with new activities and creative hobbies, arts, immersion in nature and growing food, learning about the cycles of the earth and our body's connection to the earth, expressing gratitude, even for small things, every day when you wake up in the morning and you go to sleep at night, and nurturing social connections. Maybe there's someone you can share all of your feelings and thoughts with and not have shame, but feel loved and welcomed and supported. And of course, trauma-informed learning and education, a safe place to learn, is great for mental health and brain health. Look at these beautiful faces. It turns out through my studies, I have found that the habits of brain healthy people and stress healthy people are very similar. It's having a consistent sleep schedule. It's moving and grooving your body creatively, eating a lot of vegetables and gardening, working with difficult feelings like fear and shame and grief and with trauma, really giving permission to yourself and to the people you work with for all of those feelings. And if you have a hard time with them, then it's good to do your own work or take a pause so that you don't get overwhelmed. It's important to have gratitude practices, even for small things. Sometimes if I'm having a really hard time, I go out at sunset and I look at shapes in clouds, or I look at the sunset or the sunrise, or I feel the warmth of the sun on my face. So we all have access to sky and water and earth. And sometimes it's good to be grateful for small things. That includes building positivity habits, like I was saying before, social engagement and warm, loving connections, creating spiritual connection and meaning and purpose, mindfulness, yoga, breath work, often those go together. And again, trauma-informed, safe places to learn. Trauma-informed support recognizes the role that trauma plays in someone's physiology, their psychology, their behavior, their relationships, and their thinking, their cognition. And trauma burden determines how motivated people are going to be to stay with you, to learn, to be healthy, to be socially engaged. By being aware of this, you as their teacher, their mentor, their colleague, or yourself, you can provide an environment of safety, of healing, recovery, and of repair. We need global collaboration for healing trauma in young people so that we fertilize a generation of stress resilient, mentally well, and brain healthy young leaders. And I really want to show you this young woman's very beautiful face. Taking care of the nervous system of the planet are what we're all doing. Taking care of the nervous system of the planet, one young person at a time. Thank you very much for listening. And I'm available if you need to contact me as a resource. And I just want to continue to bless you and support you in the work that you're doing. Thank you so much.